today. My name is Carolina Saavedra. I'm a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center. I'll be hosting this exciting webinar today to highlight the momentous new policy solutions to cigarette butt waste that are being pursued by Santa Cruz County and some of its municipalities, which have adopted a first-of-its-kind ordinance banning the sale of partially inconsumable cigarettes, also known as filtered cigarettes. So today's speakers are myself, today's presenters are myself, and then our main speaker, who is Tara Leonard. She is a senior health educator and project director of the Tobacco Education and Prevention Program at the Santa Cruz County Health Services Agency. Tara has been a tireless advocate for tobacco product waste policies in Santa Cruz County, highlighting the critical partnership between public health professionals and environmental advocates. Now, here is our agenda for today. I'll start with a brief introduction into the topic of partially inconsumable cigarette waste, commonly referred to as cigarette butts, and the impossibility of eliminating its harms once these products enter your communities. Then Tara will take it away with explaining Santa Cruz County's first of its kind efforts at eliminating the source of this ubiquitous toxic waste. And then please join us this Tuesday, February 10, for part 2, which will feature 2 academic researchers to discuss more in depth the extent of environmental harms and economic costs of partially inconsumable cigarette waste from a scientific perspective to illustrate the importance of policies such as the one that Santa Cruz is going with. Now, before we dive in, we have some preliminary slides. The Public Health Law Center is part of the Law and Policy Partnership to end the commercial tobacco epidemic, along with the American Lung Association. The Public Health Law Center is made up of a dedicated team of attorneys, policy analysts, and support staff who work nationwide on public health issues in the areas of commercial tobacco prevention, healthy eating, active living, and climate justice in order to address some of the causes of chronic disease. We partner with tribal leaders, federal agencies, national health advocacy organizations, state and local governments, as well as planners, researchers, community coalitions, and individuals working on public health issues to create healthier communities around the country. The Public Health Law Center offers free legal technical assistance, and we also publish widely on commercial tobacco prevention policy, and we offer trainings and webinars like this one. We do not offer legal representation, provide legal advice, or lobby. Now, we acknowledge that the land where the Public Health Law Center is located is near the Bedote, the sacred confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, and the birthplace and center of all things for the Dakota people since time immemorial. This region is also the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe and other indigenous people from many tribal nations now call this land home. Indigenous people have made and continue to make countless and uncounted contributions to this region through protection of the land, air, and water, the preservation and revitalization of indigenous foodways, and demonstrating resilience in the face of relentless adversity. We recognize that the land the Public Health Law Center currently occupies was forcibly stolen and therefore is part of the legacy of U.S. law and policy aimed at carrying out the genocide and oppression of Indigenous people, and that nonetheless, this land remains and will continue to be Indigenous land. We also recognize that connection to and stewardship of the land is important to all Native Americans, including tribal communities in California. We believe that a fundamental part of our work is to repair and address this heavy legacy of the law and to apply ourselves to supporting California tribal communities and exercising sovereignty to improve the lives of their community members. I also want to note that when at PHLC we talk about tobacco products, we are discussing industrial scale commercial tobacco products, not traditional tobacco, which is and has been used religiously, medicinally, and ceremonially by many indigenous communities and tribal nations for centuries. You can learn more about that, about traditional tobacco, by visiting keepitsacred.org. And last but not least, I want to emphasize that the work that we do at PHLC is done in consideration of advancing equity. What that means is that we are focused on partnering with communities and organizations to use the power of law in a way that addresses the social determinants of health and meets the specific needs of all communities, especially those who unfairly bear a greater burden of public health harms and other societal harms. The social determinants of health are quite relevant to our topic of discussion today, as we will highlight later on, because partially inconsumable cigarette waste or cigarette butt waste and its toxicity does not burden all communities equally. So now to get started with the topic at hand, first I just want to start with kind of dispel the notion of these items as filters, right? The industry refers to the inconsumable component of cigarettes as cigarette filters. But despite the health coded word, countless studies have shown that these items do not reduce the health harms to the person smoking the cigarettes. Instead, they just serve to improve the experience of smoking by not getting tobacco into your mouth, right, or getting the paper wet, and give the person smoking them a false sense of relative safety. And worse still, these items tend to encourage people to inhale more deeply while smoking, making cigarettes with these components potentially more dangerous than those without. No, partially inconsumable cigarette waste, aka cigarette butts, are also not biodegradable. That's another common misconception. So while they look like they're made of cotton, they're actually made up of hundreds of thin threads of cellulose acetate, which is a type of plastic. As the paper wrap degrades, these tiny threads of uh, plastic fibers loosen and spread out and break apart into countless bits of microplastics that are imbued with nicotine and other highly toxic elements, such as cadmium, lead, and arsenic. These toxic microplastics are then spread throughout our rivers, lakes, and oceans and collect in the soil and in any animal or plant that might consume them. They're a major contributor to our planet's microplastic crisis. The World Health Organization estimates that 4.5 trillion of them are improperly discarded around the world each year. So this is the equivalent of roughly 1.7 billion pounds of toxic garbage in the form of hazardous microplastics that is created annually. But to make matters worse, flicking smoked cigarettes on the ground has been an accepted cultural norm for decades, one that has been and is, continues to be encouraged by the media and big tobacco. This practice is caused in part by the mistaken belief that cigarette butts are biodegradable, right? As we said, that they are not, and that and the idea that they don't harm the environment. Because of this deception and because of the sheer number of cigarettes that are smoked each year, cigarette butts are the most littered item in the world. And downstream efforts to solve this problem, such as beach cleanups, while they are extremely commendable, are simply unsustainable. A recent study by the Policy Research Center for Tobacco and the Environment found that cleanups near a community storm drains would have to happen every other day to make any kind of a significant impact. And as we know, that's just unrealistic. So the problem doesn't start or end with littering either. Let's say that these items were not littered, but instead were thrown away into receptacles destined for the landfill or, the local solid waste site. Now, has the problem been solved or eliminated at this point? Not really, right? Even if that were to happen. So let's talk about the concept of throwing waste away and where away really is. The items we discard in the trash generally go to landfills. They have not gone away from existence, of course, but they're just simply away from us, right? Away from each home or establishment, no longer burdening them with odors, leachates, and bulk. Now, this happens repeatedly, at least weekly, for pretty much every household and business across each state. When the waste dumping sites reach full capacity, the need to create new ones arises. These noxious and often dangerous discarded items are dutifully taken away to enable our enjoyment of clean, uncluttered, smell-free spaces. But everyone is not equally provided such enjoyment. While some communities are dependably and completely relieved from the burden of their own waste, communities that sit next to landfills or hazardous waste sites are not. The waste may no longer be in our homes or local public garbage bins, but the aggregated waste from the entire community and its surroundings will come to endanger other people's health. These are the overburdened communities, and they are generally Black or brown communities or have lower incomes. Now, the predictable patterns of waste facility siting disincentivizes the general population within a city or county from seeking better ways to address waste, such as reduction. It's out of sight and out of mind for the residents who are more likely to have the ear of local government. Now, so while cities and counties should ensure that tobacco product waste, such as cigarette butts, do not litter the streets, it must also be recognized that eliminating the litter alone is insufficient. For one thing, cigarette butts are a fire risk. For another, they continue to leach toxic chemicals and heavy metals no matter where they end up. And lastly, as I just pointed out, solid waste facilities are generally sited near disadvantaged communities who will be disproportionately exposed to these toxic releases. So when we talk about policy solutions, we must center these waste burden disparities. At the end of the day, the most effective path to diminishing the compounding environmental injustices of tobacco product waste is the one that reduces or stops it at the source, such as what Santa Cruz County is on track to accomplishing with their new policy. Now, in the interest of time, I'll go through these next slides fairly quickly. I pulled these maps from Cal Environmental Screen, from the Environmental Hazards Indicator GIS Maps tool. And the links are right there if you want to check on them. You get a lot more detail if you're able to zoom in into the specific tracks, but I just wanted to give you an overview of, what it looks like in Santa Cruz County and surrounding areas. So in the solid waste on the right, you see the image of the solid waste facilities with the little orange dots being the solid waste sites. And then the brown shades, are the exposure to the hazards from, being exposed to those facilities. So the darker the shade, the more exposure there is. And then on the other side, you have poverty indicators to kind of, overlay and show like some of the, relative correlations when it comes to poverty and waste facility siting. The next one also shows drinking water contaminants. So I'm showing you that in a last one. I threw in this map from cthat.org that shows the siting of tobacco retailers. So you can see that, the harm is even more compounded when it comes to exposure to harmful commercial tobacco products and their waste, given that tobacco product waste also tends to accumulate near places where products are sold, right? The litter tends to accumulate there. So again, there is no safe or harmless end of life for partially inconsumable cigarettes. Now, while we have seen some greenwashing claims as well, that claim that the cellulose acetate from the partially inconsumable cigarettes can be reclaimed and recycled to keep them out of streets and landfills. But the result ends up likely looking like this, which is a public health nightmare. You have smoked cigarette butts that have been used to make jackets in France, park benches in Philadelphia, and most recently into stuffed animals and bug repellent. On the left, you can see the news article that is showing a worker going through this giant bag of used cigarette butts and having to sort through them with very little protection. And then you can see the end result of those teddy bears. So, a nightmare to imagine children that are going to be cuddling these little toxic teddy bears. And then on the right, you can see the giant plume of, cloud that's coming off of these cigarette toxic gin. So even if there were claims of that this cellulose acetate or plastic material from the cigarette butts could be reclaimed or recycled, where does that really mean in the actual material world? This slide is just giving you an even bigger picture of just the environmental harms, the global environmental harms of cigarette and other tobacco products and their production. You can get the idea of like how many resources from our planet are diverted into producing cigarettes that are, harmful, toxic products. And then you can see on the output side on the right, I just wanted to highlight the emissions, which are about roughly an estimated 84 metric tons of CO2 that being emitted annually, which is a significant contributor to climate change. So whose responsibility should be to deal with this giant problem, particularly the waste that comes out after consumers have enjoyed the product? So as it stands now, it's certainly not the manufacturers who are bearing any of the responsibility or cost, right? And we should change that. So that's why it, wanted to highlight that upstream policy solutions, meaning that you're cutting the source of the waste in the first place, right? Coming into the market, into your communities in the first place, is ultimately the only effective way to eliminate this problem without passing the buck to somebody else. And we're about to hear from Tara in just a moment. I just wanted to point out that upstream solutions, again, like Santa Cruz County's partially inconsumable cigarette sales ban, get to the root of the issue by preventing the sale of these products containing these toxic items in the first place. That way they're not littering your community. And the more and more jurisdictions that adopt this, the more protection that there is going to be for all communities. And with that, I want to give the floor to Tara. This is
So
the
some
first
of
part.
you might be wondering now that we're getting started, where the heck is Santa Cruz, California? Well, Santa Cruz is a coastal community. We're in Central California, south of San Francisco, and we are the home of UC Santa Cruz. And it's very important to sort of ground this work in Santa Cruz because Santa Cruz tends to have, relatively progressive politics. We are an early adopter of other tobacco-related policies like tobacco retail licensing, flavored tobacco sales ban, smoke-free parks and beaches. And it's also worth mentioning that we are blessed to have very passionate tobacco education coalition leaders and members, and this work would not have been possible without them. Next slide. And it's important to remember that staff here at the Public Health Department is what's called the local lead agency for tobacco-related issues throughout the county. We're funded by the California Department of Public Health. LLA staff do not lobby. We educate and advocate for a tobacco-free lifestyle and environment. So that brings us back to butts, a public health and environmental threat. Carolina did a great job laying the groundwork on the issues here on the slide. I'm not going to go over them again, but I will tell you that policymakers will tell you that these consequences are necessary to protect smokers from the additional harms from smoking. Next slide. But as Carolina has laid out, filters don't even work. And if you want to really do a deep dive on this, I encourage you to go to the second part of this presentation with Dr. Novotny and Dr. Atkinson, where they really provide all of the background information and the research about this. But what we know is that according to the World Health Organization, cigarette filters have no benefit in preventing the adverse health effects of smoking. And what's really insidious about that is the industry has known that for decades. They've known that for decades. And from a public health perspective, what's important to understand about that is that during the 1960s, after the Surgeon General's report on smoking and health came out, a lot of people were very motivated to quit smoking. And that could have been a real fork in the road for this industry. They could have removed their products from the market. They could have actually made their products healthier for smokers to use. But instead, what they did is they pretended that they had created a product that was healthier for smokers to use. And Dr. Novotny refers to this famously as the filter fraud. Filters were not designed to actually make the cigarettes healthier. They were designed to change the perception of harm of those products. So we have a product that really has no utility. And we have an industry that knows that. So what are they doing about it? Well, they're not doing anything about it. They take zero responsibility. And so in the public health world, we call that externalizing the cost of this product, forcing both the physical and financial burden of tobacco waste onto government agencies and volunteer organizations. Again, when you're working with policymakers, this is really, really important because what you're talking about is tax dollars. You're talking about your parks and rec. You're talking about your public works. You're talking about your volunteer organizations that you have subcontracts with to do this cleanup. And so this is a picture of an organization here in Santa Cruz called the Downtown Streets Team. This is an organization that basically pays unhoused people to do city beautification projects. And so you have to ask yourself, is this who we really want cleaning up corporate toxic pollution? Those who are experiencing unhoused and children? I think the answer to that is no. And the gentleman in the back of this picture in the light green shirt is Assemblymember Mark Stone, and we'll talk about him in just another minute. Next slide. So as Carolina mentioned, current efforts rely on downstream solutions, right? Garbage cans, smoking signs, education campaigns. And here's the thing about that. All of those so-called solutions focus on individual behavior change. And the industry loves that. Why? Because instead of focusing on the industry, it focuses on the very people that this industry has ruthlessly targeted and then gotten addicted to their products. So, of course, the industry thinks this is a great idea because they blame the smoker, not the industry. They blame the very people that the industry has addicted. Instead, we need to be looking at policy and environmental systems change. So I mentioned Mark Stone. Mark Stone was an assembly member here in California, and he was way ahead on this issue. And he introduced the first statewide filter ban in 2014. He went on to do it another couple of times, but he was never able to get any traction. The concerns that he heard from policymakers are on the screen here. They were concerned about a decrease in state revenue. They were concerned about increased health risks. They were concerned about fire, and they were concerned about creating a black market. So when I met with Mark early on in our work plan to talk about this, we really took away from we took what he learned and kind of used that as our roadmap, right? So what were our takeaways from what happened with his bills? Well, first, we have to correct misinformation, widespread misinformation. Second, we have to monetize the issue for policymakers. We want to use data and science to drive that conversation. And we need to organize so that we have public support so that the next time a bill like this is introduced, it's not an individual supporting the bill, it's thousands and thousands of people and constituents supporting the bill. Next slide. So we took that and we put it into what I'm calling our TPW policy roadmap. Any of you who've done program planning, you're very familiar with this. I think I really want to point out at the top that our theoretical framework was community organizing. So it's the community and community groups who are supported to identify the problem, mobilize resources, and implement strategies to reach their goal. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to be going through some of the aspects in this policy roadmap. And by the way, this is not linear, right? Many of these things were happening all at the same time. So we began doing TPW policy education and outreach in 2017. And these are examples of some of the things that we did. And we'll go into more detail as we move forward. But I want to point out some of the highlights because what you see in the upper left is our coalition. And when I talk about our coalition, it's our Tobacco Education Coalition here in Santa Cruz County, which is a group of volunteers and organizations and nonprofits all working together toward a shared goal. Rachel Kippen in that picture was our coalition co-chair, and she worked with TUPE. So if you're in California, TUPE is your tobacco use prevention education program, to go into schools. And this is a picture of her in the Watsonville High School. I believe that was a marine biology class, and she's lecturing to the students about tobacco waste. What came out of this? What came out of this was one of the students in that class was so interested in this issue that he reached out to me and asked if I would mentor him in his senior capstone project. And there'll be pictures later on of him and his senior capstone project. We would do things like going to health fairs, but not just health fairs, also things like Earth Day and environmental events. The picture down on the lower right is an event we held at the Museum of Art and History here in Santa Cruz, where they have events called Make Nights, where members of the public are told to come and try their hand at doing something creative. And in this case, what we did is we had kids write messages on these larger than life cigarette butts of what they think animals and plants and sea life would say to the tobacco industry. And then later on, when we would have a cleanup, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you can see this on the lower left hand, when we had a cleanup, everywhere that you picked up a cigarette butt, you would put one of these larger than life cigarette butts. And so it really made this issue visible to people who might not otherwise think about it. Next slide. So one of the things that we really realized is that tobacco waste exists at the intersection of public health and environmental health. So if you're someone like me who is used to working in tobacco education, when you think about your partners, your traditional partners, they're youth serving organizations, they're health related organizations, they're schools. But as soon as you bring in the environment, it just opens it up to all sorts of other unique and exciting partnerships. So you want to be thinking about your public works and your water quality people, your waste management, your city beautification groups. Because we are a coastal community, we worked very closely with surfing organizations. And when I talk about conservation organizations, they were places like Ocean Conservancy and Save Our Shores. But every organization or every community has these types of organizations. So maybe it's the Sierra Club, maybe it's the Boys and Girls Club. You will also have museums and zoos and aquariums, and you can think strategically, and I would argue quite creatively, about how to make the best use of those partnerships. And one of them that I think a lot of people miss is public works. In 2018, we worked with the Public Works Department to add questions about tobacco waste to one of the activities that they are mandated to do, which is a stormwater awareness survey. And they got over 1,000 results to this survey, both English and Spanish. And respondents expressed very strong support for a policy that would hold tobacco companies responsible for the cost of cleaning up cigarette litter. Now, if you work like I do in a small public health department, you might not have the capacity to go out and do a door-to-door survey of over 1,000 people across your entire county, but your public works department might have that capacity. So you want to talk to them about how to make this a win-win for everyone involved. Another group that we worked with very closely is Save Our Shores. Save Our Shores is an environmental organization here in Santa Cruz, and they do a lot of beach cleanups every single week and month. And so we had this existing cache of tobacco waste data. And you can see in that slide on the right, cigarette butts were actually the #1 identifiable piece of litter that they picked up in that 10-year period. You can see that there's plastic pieces, but we don't know what those plastic pieces are, or the paper pieces. But cigarette butts at almost 500,000 were clearly the #1 most identifiable piece of data. So that was, and here's the other great thing about that. That data was divided by jurisdiction as well. So we have this source of cleanups, but we also wanted to do our own cleanups. And we actually do 2 different types of cleanups we could talk a little bit about. We like to do these big, fun, large-scale cleanups of like an entire beach, an entire park. Why are those good? They're good because, as it says, they engage the public, they attract media, and you're getting local data. So in fact, I spoke earlier about that capstone project and the boys in the picture in the top. That's them doing their capstone cleanup in the Watsonville Plaza. We also always partnered with Save Our Shores on their coastal cleanup days. And we had these data collection cards where we didn't just pick up the tobacco waste. We talked about whether it was 10 feet from a storm drain, 10 feet from a no smoking sign, 10 feet from a garbage can. Why is that important? Because later on, when you go in front of city council members and they say, well, we just need more no smoking signs or we need more garbage cans, you know, have these fabulous little data cards. Well, you can say, well, we picked up 3,000 cigarette butts and 30% of them were actually within 10 feet of a no smoking sign or a garbage can. So clearly that's not a solution that's going to work. Now, this is the second type of cleanup that we did. And in these cases, we wanted to be much more specific, much more focused, and it makes it more easy to replicate that data from year to year. So what you see here is 1 block of Pacific Avenue in downtown Santa Cruz, and we carefully map out where are the storm drains, where are the no smoking signs, where are the garbage cans. And in this case, we also looked at outdoor dining because we have another objective in our work plan having to do with outdoor dining. And if you are concerned about how to do this, there are a lot of resources available. And one of them is through the San Diego State University. And you can click on this Kick Butts link. Oh, I can't do it. It's not me anymore. But if you go to that I Kick Butts website, they will explain to you how this new app that they have is available and how to use it. You can share images and locations. You can create customized reports and maps and tables. So that's a terrific tool for those of you who are maybe new to this concept of cigarette butt collection, and it makes everything super easy for you. The other thing we did is we engaged the media to spread key messages. Early on in our work plan, we had a budget for billboards and bus ads, and we also created this terrific documentary called Within an Inch. We also made sure, though, that we used unpaid media. So we sent out press releases whenever we were doing a cleanup event. We got a lot of earned media. And don't forget about your letters to the editor, your op-eds. These are all free ways to get your message out to the public and out to policymakers. I don't think this video is going to work, Carolina, since you're controlling the slides right now. We can see.
Let me see. Can you see it right now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes. Okay.
Let's see if it works.
Let me start it and see if you can hear it.
Yes.
When he came from Mexico, so he has that instinct.
Can you turn it up a little bit?
The land and
There we
working
go.
alongside the land, and I think that's why I was so inclined to environmentalism, because it's really a part of us. When I think about how we're so often targeted, I think about who is really to blame. Like, my dad is a heavy smoker and he does like a pack of cigarettes a day. So I think about how it's not his fault. Like, we're constantly perpetually under stress and trauma in this society. So I don't blame him.
I was one of the people who tried to ignore it, but I was in the community. I walked around, I had cleanup pickup day, and I saw so much litter. But one of the biggest pieces of garbage that I've always seen everywhere, every single place I walk, is cigarette butts.
I was part of this garbage pickup, and we picked up around 30 butts in like 10 minutes. Just on one street, just one little walk. I see tobacco, and then I see the harm.
I feel like seeing the injustices in person makes you want to change it more.
Each cigarette butt is a 1-inch long toxic waste dump. It's estimated that there are about 6,000 chemicals in tobacco smoke. Those filters absorb many of those chemicals. You also have heavy metals. Arsenic is a really important heavy metal that's concentrated. You have cadmium, nickel, lead. There's a whole wide range. If you took all of the cigarette butts that are disposed of every year and you put them in a mound, it would be like a Superfund site, federally controlled toxic waste Superfund site. I've always worn a mask for handling these, even before COVID. So these are cigarette butts that we collected at one high school. There's a Marlboro right there. This is a Parliament. There's natural American spirit. This is cultural appropriation. So those are all jewel pods. This is a menthol. These are mint. This is mango. These are really nasty.
When you ask a kid who hasn't been exposed to this issue, what do you think a cigarette filter is made out of? They say cardboard, paper. Cigarette filters are actually made of cellulose acetate. And like most forms of plastic, it never really biodegrades. As those toxins break down, they're leaching into our soil. They're getting into our riverways. They're making their way to the beach.
I love that rush you get by dropping into a steep wave and not knowing if you're going to make it or not. Hard work and preparation really dictates your success. And it's the same sort of thing in activism through surfing. I felt like I had a little bit of a platform to use my voice to try to educate others and try to inspire others. The youth is hugely important because they're the ones that are going to inherit our flaws and our mistakes. So to get them passionate about ocean conservation and really educated about the harmful effects of cigarette butts, plastic pollution, I think super important. They're gonna instill that into their kids and their kids.
We at the local level are often stuck trying to mitigate a lot of the impact, the tobacco waste. You get a little bit of that perspective of the spectrum of change, right? And it's slow and it's incremental and it's so powerful when the narrative shifts, because then that social narrative shifts, which eventually shifts and reflects in the policy. And so education and public awareness is huge.
Tobacco waste isn't any different than a lot of other issues in our community where the burden lies on low-income communities, communities of Black and brown people who have historically always borne the brunt of toxic exposure.
Can't have environmentalism if it's not also social justice, and if it's not class justice and racial justice, gender equality. It's all interconnected. And I think that's why it's really important that we center youth of color and prioritize their voices in the environmental field and those conversations, because they have that connection already.
Crecí en México, en Puerto Vallarta, y desde niña he amado la naturaleza, he tenido mucha conexión con ella. Mis papás nos llevaban a los ríos, al bosque, al mar, a la playa. Desgraciadamente veía mucha basura en la naturaleza y me daba mucha tristeza. Y como niña dije, cuando yo crezca voy a hacer algo para ayudar, para que esto cambie. It feels like Watsonville sometimes is the token that, we don't know how to protect our environment. that most of us are just field workers and don't know any better. However, the city of Watsonville has been in the front of environmental protection. Watsonville is a beautiful place. It has 800 acres of freshwater wetlands that we're all committed to protecting. So we're proud of our community. This area right here used to be a landfill, and every time it would rain, the area would flood. Our engineers looked back at their historical maps and said this is supposed to be a wetland. We've been restoring our wetlands over time, and they're looking so much better.
I feel like cigarettes and other bigger companies who sell into lower communities, they don't care. They just want to make money. They don't want to see or hear about any responsibility of what they're doing to the community or to the environment.
Hit them where it hurts. Hit them in the wallets.
And then they'll have to listen. Take responsibility for what they're doing.
This gives me hope, knowing that other people are educating themselves and are willing to come back to their community to help. Use your power, because you have power. Everybody has power. Everybody has a voice some way or another. And with that voice, you can do so many things. Just use it to your advantage, because change can happen. We just need to bring it and continue it.
Aren't those kids amazing? Every time I watch this, I get a little teary-eyed. Those are youth from Wetlands Watch here in Santa Cruz County. So yes, health equity, environmental justice. This was part of our larger program of using art and visual aids, because not everyone learns the same way. And when you throw out a word or a phrase like 4.5 trillion cigarette butts, that can be a little overwhelming. But when you roll into a city council meeting with 25,000 cigarette butts in a clear plastic case, and you say, hey, we picked up these cigarette butts a block away on Pacific Avenue in just 2 months, that can have a real impact. And then, of course, we always have these sad, pathetic pictures like this one from Karen Mason, which was taken on a beach in Florida, of a black skimmer bird, which was feeding its baby chick a cigarette butt. I've spent a lot of time in tobacco control. I've been in front of a lot of middle and high schoolers whose eyes sort of glaze over when you're talking about smoking. They can't imagine being 50, let alone being 50 with lung cancer. But when you show them a picture like this, they get very angry, and it changes the conversation. If this is an industry that you cannot trust because it is basically trashing your environment, why would you trust them when they come at you with things like bubblegum flavored vape? So to me, the discussion around tobacco waste is also a tobacco education and prevention tool. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, data, science. Decision makers need to have data. And in Santa Cruz, we knew that the tobacco waste cleanup data would be critical. And we were also lucky, because of the timing and where we live, that it just so happened that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration published this paper that showed that in 5 years of cleanup data on the shores of the Monterey Bay, 24.5% of the litter that they picked up was attributed to smoking. That's outrageous. And so, of course, we use that data as well. So link to the local and state data that's available where you live. The study on the top is Mabari, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. They published this paper just a few years ago that showed it has a fancy term, but basically it showed that microplastics are present in every layer of the water column in the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And then, of course, link to other state and national resources. If you're not in California, you'd have to look for what these are where you live. But Carolina's organization, the Public Health Law Center, published this terrific tobacco paste environmental toolkit. Dr. Novotny at the San Diego State University published a white paper. And then, of course, you have your other organizations like the World Health Organization, who have also published some very, very helpful documents. And the thing about those documents is check the references, check the resources, because there's all sorts of other documents linked that you might be able to use. So putting this all together, policy meetings early and often. Do not wait until you're on the agenda to get in front of policymakers. We would go through this cycle of having a cleanup and then having the kids who did that cleanup bring the tobacco waste that they had collected to policy meetings and talk to policymakers. So on this slide, we see kids from Watsonville High again. We see kids from Scotts Valley High. We see people from the Santa Cruz City Council. And then there's a picture here of us in front of the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors. And in front of them is Taylor Taylor Lane, who happens to be the founder of the Cigarette Surfboard. And he created this documentary film about his experience building and riding surfboards that he made out of tobacco waste. So we're busy and we're doing cleanups and we're doing events and we're doing this, but COVID hit and everyone was crazy and everyone was busy. And we realized in 2021 that even though tobacco waste was a huge problem in our community, elected officials were not really ready to put forth a policy. Rather than just give up, we were thinking, what can we do as an interim step? Well, what we did is we got the jurisdictions to pass what we called tobacco waste resolutions. So the first two cities to pass those resolutions, if you can go to the next slide, Carolina, were the City of Santa Cruz and the City of Watsonville. And it was a resolution that basically acknowledged that this is an issue, but more importantly, it got on the official record that this body resolved to advance policy approaches to reduce or eliminate this toxic waste. Now, in this case, there wasn't an actual deadline in this document. We learned that as we moved along, that that would be a good idea to do that. So then what happened? Nothing. Like I said, it was COVID. We were having fires. We were having floods. There was all sorts of other things going on. But now we have this document. So literally a year later, on the anniversary of signing the city council resolution, our public advocates, our community went back to the city council and said, hey, it's been a year. You said you were going to do this. It's time to get working on it. So what the City of Santa Cruz did is they assigned this work to their Health and All Policies Committee. So if you go to the next slide, Carolina, the Health and All Policies took up this issue, and one of the first things that they did is they announced a public opinion poll, and they put that on the city website. And because it was early in this work, that poll was not about a ban on the sale of filters. It was basically saying, what kind of policy would you support? And there was like a menu of 8 policies. And what we found was that prohibiting the sale of single-use cigarette filters was the top policy that survey respondents were interested in pursuing. So again, data, data, data. The next thing that we did at the City of Santa Cruz, because remember when we were talking about Mark Stone and monetizing the issue, we wanted to quantify the local financial burden on communities for having to deal with this waste. So again, I worked with City Public Works and the Center for Tobacco and the Environment at San Diego State. They've created this model that communities can use, and you can take your local data and you can estimate how much tobacco waste costs your area. What does that mean? It's things like mechanical street sweeping and manual cleanup and stormwater maintenance and solid waste management, anti-litter regulations, et cetera, et cetera. We plugged all this into the model and we got an estimate that the City of Santa Cruz spends over $2 million a year mitigating tobacco waste. Okay, life happened again. And what happened is one of our key champions on the city council was nominated to the board of supervisors. He was interested in bringing this work with him to the board of supervisors. So that's great. None of the work that we did at the city was wasted because we were able to bring those resources and bring that experience with us to the Board of Supervisors. So the Board of Supervisors in 2023 passed their resolution. But by then we learned a couple things. By then we decided that we did want to focus it on tobacco butts. And we also decided that we had to put a deadline into that resolution. So they put a deadline of January of 2025 to come back with concrete policy recommendations. The other important thing that the Board of Supervisors did is they committed to contacting the other 4 jurisdictions so there would be this cross-jurisdictional collaboration. And they created this ad hoc committee that was going to work on this issue. So the TPW ad hoc committee met for about a year and a half. It was co-chaired by the 2 supervisors you see in the top right corner, Manu Koning and Justin Cummings. And it included community leaders and nonprofit partnerships and representatives, like I said, from the 4 cities. We hosted all sorts of numerous education and outreach events, including a tobacco retailer listening session. We evaluated a variety of policy approaches, and we also worked with Carolina and others at the Public Health Law Center to develop model policy language.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself. Yes, so the model policy language, it's important when drafting model policy or drafting policy that is going to be potentially used by a jurisdiction. You know, it's very important to as Tara said, rely on the data and see what it is the community is trying to achieve. But it's once you get to the crafting part, to ensure that the language is going to be clear and concise and comprehensive, and that it's going to be easy to effectively implement and enforce the policy once it's actually live. So Santa Cruz County adopted the term partially inconsumable cigarettes and cigars, which is defined as any cigarette or cigar that is containing an embedded component or part, commonly referred to as or marketed as a filter, that is not intended to be consumed, whether it is made of any material, including but not limited to plastic, cellulose acetate, or other fibrous plastic material, or any other inorganic, organic, or biodegradable material. Now, there's a lot in that language, but essentially the reason that you know, I believe the policymakers in Tara were interested in not having that language, the filter language be what defines the policy is because they wanted to avoid giving credence to the industry deception that these items are filtering out carcinogenic components or carcinogenic elements from the person who is using the cigarettes, right? And therefore, it was intentional to ensure that there is an item like partially inconsumable cigarette that more accurately describes the item that the policy is seeking to ban the sale of. And partially inconsumable cigarette is more accurate than filter, as we learned throughout this presentation. Now, the definition is not also not focused on any particular material, and this was really important, right? So it bans whether the component is made of any material. Whether it's cellulose acetate, like we talked about extensively throughout this presentation, or any other kind of plastic, or even any other kind of plant-based cellulose material, or even just anything that might be, called biodegradable by the industry. And the reason for that is that, as we've learned in other policies where the tobacco industry is involved, they're not particularly transparent or forthcoming about all the ingredients that go into the components that are placed inside their products. And so the burden should not be on the policy makers and the enforcers to learn everything that is going into this material in order to actually be able to effectively ban it, right? Because the industry could just turn around and say, well, this is not cellulose acetate, it's some other form of acetate or some other form of cellulose or some other material altogether. And how are you going to prove it? Are you going to hire a bunch of scientists and a bunch of lab equipment and then try to, determine each of them? And if they say, well, we changed our material now, right? It would be like a game of whack-a-mole. So making it comprehensive, because at the end of the day, whatever that little piece is made of, the harms, the environmental harms, the toxicity, the cost, the harm to wildlife, all of that remains the same. So I'll let Tara keep going.
Great. Thank you, Carolina. Okay, so we've got our model policy language, we've got our community support, we've got our champions. But before we go to the first meeting, we want to make sure that we can respond to what we know we're going to hear from the tobacco industry. And one of the first questions is, won't smokers just get these products online? Now, again, depending on where you live, the answer to this question might be different. But in California, we have Assembly Bill 3218, which went into effect in 2025, which basically says that any provision of a local tobacco retail license ordinance automatically applies to online and delivery sales. So if you have a policy that says you can't have flavored tobacco, or in this case, you can't have filtered tobacco, you're not allowed to mail those products into that jurisdiction either. The other thing that we did is we looked at tobacco sales revenue data, and the county had passed its ban on the sale of flavored tobacco products in 2019, which was great because we were able to look back at what happened to the county retailers after that policy. And what we found was that there was indeed a brief 3.1% decline in sales tax revenue over the first 6 months. Then that was followed, regrettably, frankly, by double-digit increases because consumer behavior adjusted. As we know, the tobacco industry is diversifying and they're moving away from a lot of inhalable products to your non-inhalable products. But again, this counters an argument that you're going to hear from your tobacco retailers. And then the other thing, of course, is that cigarette use is trending down. Cigarettes are a concern to the industry, both because of secondhand smoke and because they know that litter is a problem. Can you go to the next slide, Carolina? And so again, this is California data, but according to the 2022 California Health Survey, 6% of adults use cigarettes and only 1.3% of high school students are using cigarettes, which is the future of this industry. So in fact, this is becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of retailers' bottom line. Okay, great. We've got all of our data, we've got our supporters, and we've got this great grassroots campaign. So before we went to the first meeting, there was one-on-one meetings with every supervisor, multiple county departments and committees like Fish and Wildlife, Commission on the Environment. We had 50 letters of support, we had op-eds, we had letters to the editor, we had signed petitions, and I think very importantly, we had dozens and dozens of speakers representing health and education and environment, as well as individual students and parents and teachers and healthcare providers. And you have to realize that this is a meeting that's taking place in like the middle of a day on a Tuesday, right? So the fact that that many people showed up was actually very impressive. And it worked. We had policy success. And on October 8th, the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to ban the sale of filtered tobacco products. They did, however, add a friendly amendment. And the amendment was that they would not enforce this policy until 2 additional jurisdictions in the county approved a similar ordinance. This makes sense, right? Because you want to pass a policy in as wide a geographical area as possible in order to avoid, cross-jurisdictional sales, which is again a concern of retailers. So that's fine. That just gave us sort of more wind in our sails to go ahead and do that. So at that point, we'd already laid a lot of the groundwork with the city of Santa Cruz. So we went back to the city of Santa Cruz. And this is when the sleeping giant woke up and big tobacco suddenly realized like, oh my gosh, this is like actually happening. I don't think they were sure that it was going to pass at the county, but when it did, they came to life. And so 24 retailers showed up at that first meeting. They were wearing matching shirts and they had signs. And in fact, they even created this entire website about tobacco waste in Santa Cruz. But the good news is, we were prepared. We had our science and our data-driven responses. We were ready to counter all of their arguments and all of the misinformation with the real numbers. And so sure enough, the city of Santa Cruz also passed it unanimously, 7-0. And then we moved on to the city of Capitola, which soon followed in August, also with 5-0. And with the passage of the third policy, we instituted a cross-jurisdictional implementation and enforcement committee, which is now working to help tobacco retailers transition away from these products. So by March of 2026, we'll be doing education to retailers, including a cover letter, frequently asked questions, and a graphic of the various allowed and disallowed products. But we also are going to be sending out a retailer survey. Throughout April, we're going to gather and analyze those responses, and then based on those responses, create a more extensive retailer transition toolkit with information about customer services, business strategies, alternative products, other resources to ease the transition away from the sale of filtered products. And then enforcement begins in the city and county of Santa Cruz in January of 2027, with Capitola following in July of 2027. And we did it with 3 minutes to spare.
Perfect. So now we have quite a bit of time for questions. We do have to end on time, but they're here to answer any questions that you might have. You can go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. And thank you so much to Tara for just being a powerhouse, really, when it comes to fighting back against tobacco product waste in general, and just being such a great public health advocate in Santa Cruz County. And also
Thank
for
you,
this
Carolina.
amazing presentation, of course.
Well, and I have to add, this is a perfect place to say none of this would have happened without so many valuable TA providers and support, and our coalition members and our policy advocates. And this is by no means a one-woman show. This was a community effort from beginning to end.
Yes, and I do want to say that the webinar is recorded and it will be on our website after the fact, that the publichealthlawcenter.org, and the slides will be there, the recording will be there, and any other materials that are relevant will also be there. So wanted to make sure I answered that.
So I can look at some of the questions. Is someone else, do you want me to do that? So I'm seeing a
Yeah.
question in the questions from Barbara Bella in San Francisco that says, so you can't mail into anywhere in California, just to clarify.
Yes.
You can't mail flavored tobacco products into anywhere in California because there's a statewide ban on flavors. But that same policy would apply to any elements of your local TRL. So if this filter policy goes into our local TRL, which it has in those three jurisdictions, you could not mail filtered products into those three jurisdictions.
Yeah, so I think this question came up when you were on the slide talking about AB 3218, which basically had the provision of, like under the unflavored or flavored sales ban, and that is California statewide, you cannot, mail those products. But as Tara pointed out, you also cannot like send online or sell online or mail the products into jurisdictions, any products that are banned by that jurisdiction from being sold within that jurisdiction. So that's very, very specific. So this particular policy would only apply within unincorporated areas of Santa Cruz County, Santa Cruz City, and Capitola, unless any other jurisdictions adopt it down the line as well.
So I also see a question here. Okay. The SFDPH, Department of Public Health, is very reluctant to be engaged with us. Are the rules different in Santa Cruz? So it's not about the rules. It's about your funding through the California Department of Public Health and what objectives are in your scope of work. I don't know what the situation is in terms of your Department of Public Health exactly, but I can tell you that, this is a time of limited funding, limited staffing, limited capacity. And so it's very difficult if a specific objective isn't in your scope of work to spend time and resources on that objective. There's a lot of tobacco work going on right now around the flavors ban, around smoke-free multi-unit housing, around education and prevention with youth. So we could talk offline about exactly what the specific barriers are there, but I'm extremely sympathetic to other public health departments and their capacity.
So there's another question that just popped into the Q&A box from Tracy. It says, does the partially inconsumable portion language cover a ban on sales of nicotine pouches as well? So the language is partially inconsumable cigarettes or partially inconsumable cigars. So it only applies to those specific types of combustible products. It does not apply to any other tobacco products outside of that. And I can let Tara speak as to a little more as to why the county decided to go that way. But
Sure.
it is important to know that yes, that there is a distinction. Although there is no reason why other jurisdictions couldn't adopt a broader more comprehensive salesman, but of course that has to be done very carefully and with all the backing of the community and the data and everything else, like Tara explained.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, at a certain point, we had a whole menu of policy approaches that we could have gone with. And we all know, right, that e-cig devices are a nightmare environmentally, right? They're a triple threat with their toxic e-juice and their batteries and their plastic. But again, you have to look at the data and the support in your community. We had 10 years of data that basically showed that the number one item picked up on our streets, parks, and beaches was cigarette filters. If we had found thousands and thousands and thousands of pouches, we would have gone a different way. What tends to happen with the e-cigarette devices, and Carolina talked about this a little bit as well, in this concept of a way, those tend to be more of a problem in your legal waste stream, whereas we were really focusing on illegally discarded butts, things that were just flicked on the ground. So again, I encourage you to do that community assessment, to find out what your community supports, and to go with where the data leads you. That was kind of our North Star through this entire process.
Yeah, but I do want to add that the nicotine pouches that are used are also, I keep seeing more and more of them too. So, that's definitely a growing trend. There's another question in the chat that says, how is the mailed product ban enforced? And I think this is related to the prior question we answered about, how to prevent the online sales of these same products, how to ensure that the industry is not going around enforcement by simply just shipping them online. And of course, that's always that's always a bit more complicated to try to enforce, things that are shipping directly from manufacturer to somebody's home. So most of the time, my understanding is, because I don't work in enforcement, would be that there is, either complaints or reports or potential, decoy purchases to see what happens, right, down the line, depending on the resources that each jurisdiction has and whatever rules they have for it when it comes to enforcement. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's a tough one. Our
yeah.
enforcement tends to focus on the brick and mortar stores. And as soon as you're talking about mailed products, it gets more difficult. And so we do have in our DOJ enforcement grants, some of our jurisdictions have written in this decoy type of stuff to where they would pretend to be a purchaser and see how that would work out. But it's difficult. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. Enforcement is critical and is frequently the most difficult part of this entire cycle.
Yes, but the more education there is, of course, in the community, the more likely it is that people will either let you know that it's happening, or maybe just, it might also encourage people who may have already been thinking about, quitting to, have additional motivations for doing so. Okay, and I see that Marilyn helped out with um, a link right here that talks about compliance. So I think that is a really useful resource, I believe, to see how different compliance tactics may help with enforcing different types of tobacco prevention policies. So,
Carolina, we have a few minutes. Did you want to say anything about Baltimore? Anything more about the
oh
Baltimore?
yes, yes, I do want to let everybody know that in about, I think, Anais, correct me if I'm wrong, but in about an hour, we have another webinar that is hosted by my wonderful colleague Willow from PHLC as well, that is going to be talking all about the Baltimore litigation. As some of you may know, Baltimore City sued six tobacco manufacturers and distributors in Baltimore because of this cigarette butt litter problem in their cities. And they also have a bunch of data that they gathered and everything else. They have the Mr. Trash Wheel. That is this cute like giant machine that like patrols their harbors and rivers and collects all this waste from the water. And a lot of it, I think ends up being I mean, item like number wise, a lot of it ends up being cigarette butts too. And there's been a lot of economic costs when it comes to trying to get these the environmental impact, and so they are seeking to sue the manufacturers for damages and recovery and to mitigate or remediate the problem. And so that litigation is ongoing. There's been a lot of uh, events happening. It started back in 2022, I believe, and you'll hear a lot more details about it. It's really exciting too. It's another way of potentially looking for some relief. But, even if you were to engage in some kind of litigation like Baltimore, you're not foreclosed unless you have any kind of preemption in your state. But you're not foreclosed from also trying to pursue some upstream policies like tariffs, where you have control over exactly what the outcome is going to be.
And Carolina, do you want to just go to the next slide? It has all of our contact information. Feel free to reach out to me
Oh, yeah.
directly. My email is on there. Our website is on there. Um, Happy to help.
Yes, yes, please. And again, the slides will be available. And please do not forget as you leave today you can get the QR code for this survey. And if you could please complete it, it would really help us out to know, what is interesting you, what we can make improve, et cetera, et cetera. So please do so if you have a chance as you're heading out. And we have a few minutes before we are scheduled to end. So, there's time. Please take that time to do it. So unless we have any other questions, I think, oh wait, there's a couple of questions I see now. One more. From Jimmy. Are language assistance or translated materials being provided to retailers? It says, in a community I previously worked in, language accessibility was a real challenge, and some retailers share that outreach materials weren't available in the language they understood, which made compliance harder. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Let me see. Oh. Um, yeah. I think that's a, for retailers that like maybe speak primarily different languages and may have a hard time to understanding, I think it is very helpful to have materials that are translated. I know that there's always difficulties with resources sometimes in accomplishing that, but we have a lot of partners in the tobacco prevention community that would more than likely be very willing to assist with that, I believe, Tara. And Nicole has a question about whether the follow-up email will contain the evaluation. Yes, we'll include the survey. So we'll make sure that we include a survey or the survey link as well, in case you're not able to get the QR code. If you are, for any reason, watching on your phone, I think you can take a screenshot of it and you're still able to click on it and the link will pop up. Oh, and NIE's just enter the link. Thank you. So everybody please grab it before you head out. Yeah, so Tara, anything else you want to add before we close off?
I guess the only other thing I will add is I have been asked in the past about there was such a focus on Watsonville, and yet Watsonville was not one of the three communities that ended up passing a policy. And, you just have to be flexible about what's going on in a community, what their priorities are, what their funding looks like. But the other thing that I really want to give a shout out to Watsonville is I mentioned that the county and the city had passed a ban on the sale of flavored tobacco products in 2018, 2019. When the city of Watsonville did that, it took it a whole nother step and it banned the sale of all electronic smoking devices as well. So they were feeling like they had already removed this product from their stores that was still in the other stores. And so there was that sense of like inequity. So that's the kind of detail you really want to stay on top of in terms of what policies are being passed where and how does that impact the retailers and how that question about equity is going to come back around. So Watsonville is actually pretty far ahead in terms of other retail policies. So I want to give them a shout out for that and acknowledge that that makes it more difficult then to pass another policy on top of that.
Yes, and as we talked about all the health harms, we didn't really get into it, but we have other materials, and I believe Tara and I know Rise has a lot of materials about like the environmental harms of tobacco product waste, and in particular in rural communities and communities that have a lot of agriculture, and how harmful that is to the soil where you're trying to grow your crops, and to the health of your plants as well, and even like the natural aerators that you have and the pollinators, right, that are going to suffer as a result of this cigarette butt waste and all those leachates going into the soil and into the plants and the water.
Which is probably a good time to put in a plug for Endgame. Because honestly, as I go through this work, as we're dealing with the transition, as we're working out the details of what's covered and what's not, and how complicated it is, and what's a tipped cigarette and what's a tipped and filtered cigarette, you just come back to the sense that like, wow, the easiest thing for everyone involved would just be to ban the sale of all tobacco products. And I'm very proud to live in a state where that has now happened in 4, maybe 5 jurisdictions. Are we at 5 now? 5 jurisdictions that have passed either almost an entire ban or a full ban with no exceptions on the sale of tobacco products. That is the future. That is what we should all be looking forward to.
Yes, Chris Bostic says 4 right now, 5th on the way.
5th on the way. All right.
Yeah. And thank you all. And thank you all for the great feedback that you're leaving, all the congratulations. And Tara's presentation was really packed with so much great resource and information highlighting all the amazing work that her and her team have been doing for years. So thank you all for joining us again. And don't forget part 2 on Tuesday with Dr. Novotny and Dr. Atkinson. That's part 2 of this webinar. So if you can, please show up. Otherwise, it will be recorded, but help us out.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.